suburban radio show. Because World War III is a really bad idea. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome to our show. It's Monday, April 8th, 2013, start of a brand new week. We got a lot of stuff to talk about today. Phone lines are open, 800-313-9443, 800-313-9443. Manny's sitting in our control room, twiddling the dials, keeping us out of trouble, and ready to answer the phone when you call on in. Now, obviously, the big news over on the corporate media is that former Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher has passed away. She was 87. She had a good run. You can't complain about, reaching 87. And apparently passed from a stroke. So the corporate media is lionizing her and looking back at all the good things she supposedly did, and of course ignoring the bad things that she did. For those of you who, like me, grew up in the era of the Mickey Mouse Club, Annette Funicello also passed away, and that basically is our obituary section for today's show. Connotation is still going on in the corporate media. They're spending all this news about Beyonce went to Cuba. How could she do that? Do we have to file charges? And it's like, doesn't the U.S. government have more important things to think about? First of all, it is in fact legal for U.S. citizens to travel to Cuba. There is a charity that recycles pianos here in the United States and takes them down there. To get around the embargo, because those Cuban people, they're not allowed to have brand new pianos. They might do something terrible with those brand new pianos, and I forget the name of the organization, but I saw a documentary about that not too long ago. They're still going on and on about Jodi Arias. Oh, was she the victim of spousal abuse? Does that justify her stabbing her significant other however many times she did it? I still would like to see the defense bring up the possibility that Jodi Arias was on prescription antidepressants, but so far that seems to be off the table in that courtroom. Now, turning to the economy, the plunge protection team has just started working their magic on the American stock market. It had opened really low and was struggling. Now, all of a sudden, we're seeing this huge upsurge, and the NASDAQ and S&P are just slightly in the green. The Dow is playing catch-up, but once again, it's all counterintuitive, and they're propping up the markets. Now, an interesting little story that, and this is coming out of Zero Hedge, as confidence in the dollar continues to erode. We are now up to over a dozen U.S. states have either passed or are considering legislation to declare gold as legal tender. Now, it's really kind of interesting because in response to this, a listener sent in a scan of a $10 Federal Reserve note. And if you read that little legal tender block of text up there just above and to the left of Alexander Hamilton, it says, can be exchanged for lawful money at the U.S. Treasury. And it kind of reminds you that the Federal Reserve note isn't really lawful money. It's a debt instrument. So people are losing confidence in the dollar all over the world, and now we're having all these states are trying to say, well, we want to have gold and silver and something else of fixed value as legal tender, at least within our state borders. And, of course, Bernanke is fighting this tooth and nail. They're desperate to keep this little Ponzi scheme going, not just within the United States, but on a global scale, rather. And so we're going to start seeing this happen. Remember what happened with the Liberty Dollar? As soon as they put Ron Paul's picture on it, Bush sicked the Treasury Department on him, and they said, oh, it's a counterfeit currency because it has the word dollar on there, which is nonsense because all over America, local communities have what they call trade dollars. Zimbabwe uses the word dollar. Dollar is not a trademark owned by the Federal Reserve or the U.S. government. It's just an excuse to go after him because Bush's feelings were hurt. They put Ron Paul on the silver coin instead of him. It's really what it's all about. All right, we got to take a break for commercials. I got to clear my throat here, and we'll be right back after these words from our sponsors. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're talking about the economy, and people are still very much concerned over what happened in Cyprus with the haircut of large savings accounts. Actually, it was a castration, and could it happen here? Well, we already know the American people are being looted to prop up the Ponzi scheme central bank through various taxpayer bailouts, TARP, the rest of the turning a blind eye to all the massive foreclosure fraud that was going on. to basically steal wealth from the American people to prop up this financial system, which cannot be made to work forever. It is by design going to collapse. Like any other Ponzi scheme or pyramid, they're just desperate here to keep it going a little bit longer until it's somebody else's problem to deal with the final collapse here. Now, there's an interesting article, and this is over at Poor Richard's blog. We have been talking for several weeks about how the government is sort of hemming and hawing about forcing Americans who have their private retirement accounts, the IRAs and the 401ks, to basically liquidate them and turn the money over to the U.S. government for a new government-managed retirement program. Now, we already have a government-managed retirement program called Social Security, and they have been taking money from every worker out of every single paycheck that you were supposed to trust the government would be invested and they would pay a return to help you through your retirement. And Social Security is broke. Starting with the Clinton administration, the federal government has been borrowing the cash out of Social Security, replacing it with Treasury bonds, which now they can't make good on. So with that track record in mind, oh yes, by all means sign us up for yet another government-run retirement program that we will trust, put our wealth into. And a lot of people are very resistant to this idea. Well, it looks like Obama is considering a halfway measure because now Obama is talking about putting a cap on the amount of money they can have in an IRA or a 401k. And above that limit, if you have any other funds that you want to set aside for retirement, then you would go into this new government-run retirement program where you would give your wealth to the government and they would give you a pretty printed piece of paper that says they'll give it back to you somewhere down the road. And so it is sort of halfway to Cyprus. People who have saved for their retirement are going to lose above a certain level on their IRAs and 401ks. They're going to be forced to give that money to the government, and the government will go out and do what they did basically with Social Security. They'll take the money and spend it as general revenues and leave it to the next administration to sort out the mess, because that's the way they have been doing that. Now, there's an interesting little article, and this is over at Washington's blog, and they're commenting on a story that appeared in Bloomberg. And it's basically reiterating something we've been talking about for quite some time here at Republic Broadcasting. The headline is, "Everything you know about money is wrong." And quoting from Bloomberg, it says, "There are, broadly speaking, two accounts of the origin and history of money. One is elegant, intuitive, and taught in many introductory economics textbooks. The other is true. In other words, a lot of what we are taught about money and banking is a complete myth. It's a complete fiction. The actual mechanism of debt money creation and fractional reserve banking and its Ponzi nature are intentionally withheld from the American people." And I went through this when I was in grade school, get the little film strip about how wonderful the Federal Reserve is, and this is the only way banking can run, and it's going to be a really great thing for everybody. Obviously, so many years on, we know that is not the case. And so when you understand that the true nature of banking is being withheld from you, that secrecy tells you it's not being run for your benefit, it's being run for the benefit of the bankers. I think it was Henry Ford who said, "It is a good thing that the American people don't know how the banking system really works, or there would be a revolution by morning." I'm going from memory on that one, so if I have the attribution wrong, please forgive me. Now, a very telling article came out of alternate.org, and the headline is "Fiduciary Duty to Cheat." And it's commenting on the fact that, yes, there has always been fraud within the American financial sector. But it has gone so completely out of control. It is accepted. It is not prosecuted. And it's reached a point where the morality of Wall Street is that you should cheat and engage in fraud to make as much money for your shareholders as you can. And the shareholders don't care where the money is coming from. They just want their steak dinners. They don't care how the cows are being slaughtered. And so fraud is the new normal on Wall Street. And that's the mindset. And as long as the federal government refuses to arrest and prosecute the fraudsters, there will be more fraud. Because it's much easier to make vast fortunes through fraud than through honest business. And that, too, of course, is a hallmark of a fascist economy. Now, some of the fraud is finally catching up with the banks, and the Bank of America has agreed to a settlement to members of the military whose homes were foreclosed on improperly. It was a huge scandal. Our young men and young women were off in the war zone risking life and limb to prop up the Federal Reserve, and the banks were basically taking advantage of their absence to go through and foreclose on their homes. And so Bank of America has agreed to a settlement to reimburse 316 service members to the amount of about $116,785 each, plus some additional interest for their lost homes. And I can just imagine what nice homes these veterans will be able to move into for just $116,000 in the current market. No wonder they're trying to disarm the veterans. The gun grabbers are out there saying, oh, the veterans are dangerous. They're mentally ill from the war that we put them in and all the drugs we're feeding. We've got to disarm the veterans. What they're doing is they're disarming that segment of the population already trained up to fight in a war for when the federal government declares war on the 50 states. And I'm sure it's going to make the bankers a lot more relaxed if all these veterans they cheated out of their homes aren't able to do anything about it. Over at the Halifax Bank of Scotland, the former CEO, James Crosby, who was basically in charge of the HBOS rather, when it collapsed, is still getting a retirement worth about £25 million. Why is it that these bank executives are making so much money even when they fail? They're walking away insanely rich. I'm wondering why the stockholders aren't complaining about this, because every pound that is going to this guy's retirement is money coming out of potential returns to the investors. But it really is insane the amount of money they're being paid. And if they're being a huge success and making a lot of money for their stockholders, that's all well and good. But these are guys who created their own financial institutions. And they're still walking away rich. We're incentivizing failure along with incentivizing fraud. Now, speaking of more fraud, even though Obama forced through his foreclosure fraud settlement, where he got the 50 states attorneys general to drop all criminal investigations, the civil suits are still going on, and more states in the United States are going after the mortgage electronic registration system for fraud and for tax evasion. Now remember, a large amount of tax revenue in the states is generated when you transfer the title for your house. Every time that title is transferred, there are transfer fees. It is a tax that goes to the state government. And the mortgage electronic registration system, which basically assumed ownership of the title and then swapped the assignment around for all this mortgage bundling, was evading taxes. So they're starting to go after that as well. I am still wondering if all of this confusion over notes and titles and breaking the link between them was the result of a software error in that mortgage electronic registration system, because it just basically sprang up just in time to serve the mortgage-backed securities industry. I don't know that it was tested robustly, and there's been a nightmare in the court system of finding out who actually owns the note and the title on any given piece of property. So it's something I think ought to be looked at in hindsight. PIMCO's Bill Gross, in an interview with Bloomberg, has gone clear and says he's not the great investor everybody seems to think he is. He says the last 25 years of easy money from the Fed means anybody in the financial system can be a player and look good. And I've commented on this before. The Federal Reserve is just pouring out all this easy money to Wall Street for just a few percentage points interest. The Wall Street speculators will take that money, they'll buy into the stock market, they'll run a stock up, sell out, pay back the money to the banks, and the leftover they get to put in their pocket for having contributed nothing whatsoever to society. They're just gaming the system. And now, of course, the Federal Reserve is stuck. The instant they turn off that fire hose of newly created money, the stock market's going to crash. I'm sure they're out there with the fire hose today, and that's why the market's going up again. They're now trapped. What was an occasional thing to do, they're now dependent on. Flooding easy money onto Wall Street, keeping that stock market propped up in order to keep all the banks and investment houses solvent. They can't stop it. They can't stop doing it. They can't go back to being honest without collapsing. Going to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back.
In New York City.
And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. And there's a very revealing, or call it a confirmation article, over at Global Research. It's called The Assault on Gold, the Fed's attempt to scare people away from gold and silver. We have been talking about this for quite some time. As the dollar declines, as the U.S. economy looks less and less trustworthy, obviously physical gold and silver look very, very attractive. And this article basically lays out several documented methods the Federal Reserve has been using to try and drive gold and silver prices down. We know about the use of the paper contracts to keep the price artificially low. We know that the British government is now looking into the London gold and silver fix to see if it, like LIBOR, was being rigged. And this article lays out how the Federal Reserve was using its too-big-to-fail banks to short precious metal markets to drive the prices down. And they were doing it with naked shorts, which are supposed to be illegal. And they're playing in the paper bullion market. And we already know over in Europe, some of the big banks there have defaulted on gold deliveries. And they're trying to settle their contracts for nice piles of that freshly printed ink and paper stuff. And I imagine at some point some of those investors who bought these paper gold futures contracts are going to be saying, I don't want the paper, I want the physical metal, and the lawsuits are going to start. And so we've been speculating for quite some time. Some of the media stories about gold and silver's in a bubble, you don't want that icky poo metal. It's all part of a propaganda campaign to keep your money in the banks, keep your money in the stock market, by artificially suppressing the price of silver and gold, which means when that cap comes off, physical gold and physical silver are going to go right through the roof. It's just a question of how much longer can they keep the fraud going. And I don't think it's going to be very long, because along with those Dutch banks who are unable to deliver physical that they contracted to do, we're now seeing gold shortages prop up in other parts of the world. There's an acute gold shortage being reported in southern India. The people of India are very much into gold. Gold jewelry, gold coins, whatever. Now the dealers there can't find gold to meet the demand. Also over in Bangkok, Thailand, which had a huge physical gold jewelry, coin, bar industry going on over there, they can't find a new supply. So along with Texas asking for their bullion back from the New York Federal Reserve, Germany asking for their bullion back, Venezuela asking for their bullion back, it is only a matter of time before somebody comes up short and says, look, we're sorry, we don't have it. I know you put your bars down in our vault and paid us monthly to keep it all safe here, but, you know, golly, we had to do something else with it. We had to lease it out to those paper gold dealers to make good on their contracts. And we can't get it back from them, and that way we can't give it back to you, which tells us that sooner or later, probably right after they succeed in grabbing all your guns, there will be another gold confiscation in this country. Because it has happened before. Now, even the Dallas Federal Reserve is saying it is now time to break up the large banks. When they grow so large and powerful and wealthy that even the federal government dares not stand up to them, then it's no longer America. America is supposed to be a nation with a democratically elected Republican government that is executing the will of the people, more or less. And we understand the system is not perfect and there's all kinds of corruption. But when the federal government will not stand up to the banks, then the banks have become the government. And that is not a nation I care to live in. Certainly not a nation I wish our children to grow up in. I mean, we have Alan Greenspan on video saying the Federal Reserve answers to no federal government agency. They are a power unto themselves. And it's certainly not the nation that we were taught we were living in our school classrooms. Tell us about the House of Representatives and the Senate and the President and the Supreme Court. They don't mention the fact that the private central bankers are making the rules. And we know that was their agenda. Remember what Rothschild said. Give me control of a nation's money, and I care not who makes the laws. We're there. We're living Rothschild's dream, Rothschild's nightmare. And we're all feeling the pain for it. And the government is desperate for your wealth. Any way they can get it, anything they can come up with that you'll sit still for. Over in Maryland, now we've already seen this in places like Oregon. Maryland is now considering a rain tax. In other words, rain that falls on your property that doesn't go into the soil and the aquifer, you'll be taxed for. If you have a rain barrel, if you have your own private little garden, if you have a swimming pool that the rain is falling into and staying trapped, they're going to tax you for it. I had a reader write in and say, well, I was taught that God made the rain. Can I send the tax bill to God? Or at least to the Pope? But you got to admit, it's getting a little ridiculous when they're trying to tax raindrops that fall on your property. We'll be right back after these words from our sponsors. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And we are now hearing yet another report. This is coming out of the Daily Bail, that the United Nations has renewed their push for a global tax. Everybody on planet Earth will be taxed directly to support the United Nations, even though the United Nations cannot hold its membership in control, specifically Israel, which had 2 conditions placed on their membership, conditions that Israel has blatantly ignored. Israel holds the all-time world record for defying the most United Nations resolutions. And with a track record of success like that, the United Nations now wants a global tax on us all. They want to tax everything out there. And, of course, everybody's still pushing for their carbon tax. That evil global warming, we must fight that and you must pay for it. These institutions, the federal government, government of Israel, United Nations, have survived for so long on fraud and deception and propaganda, they've forgotten any other way to function. They don't know how to work. They're clueless, working in a world of facts and science and logic. They don't know how to do it. They are failing to evolve to meet the change in the environment, meaning a globally aware, globally interconnected population. And that's why they're ultimately going to go extinct. Over at From the Trenches World Report, Jim Willey is out there saying the economy will implode. It's inevitable because of that Ponzi scheme at the core of it all. Private central bankers issuing the public currencies alone at interest. He is estimating that when the artificial fraud to keep gold and silver prices finally collapses, he's predicting gold will be somewhere around $8,000 an ounce, and silver will be between $150 and $250 per ounce. I think when you factor in the collapse of the dollar itself, the numbers will be even higher than that. Because when it all comes apart, the U.S. dollar is going to be worth about the same as the dollar down in Zimbabwe, which is to say, hardly worth the ink and paper that it's printed on. Now, last week we were talking about negotiations between Australia and China to trade directly with each other without going through the dollar. And now it is being reported they have reached a deal. All trade between China and Australia will be denominated in the yuan or the Australian dollar. And the American dollar is not a factor any longer. And I'm sure this is going to ramp up the call to somehow get into a war with China that we're hearing coming from Wall Street and Washington, D.C. Meanwhile, interesting little story. We were commenting last week about how Portugal's Supreme Court, their constitutional court, ruled that the austerity measures being imposed by the European Central Bank were unconstitutional. They violated Portugal's constitution and they had to be thrown out. Well, now we're getting a report, and this is coming out of ZeroHedge.com, that the European Commission, the Troika, the European Central Bank, the money junkies, are literally threatening Portugal, that they have to get their constitutional court in line. You make that court declare our austerity constitutional, even if it isn't. And once again, we see how it is the private bankers who are calling the shots, not just here in the United States of America, but in Europe. Give me control of a nation's money supply, and I care not who makes the laws. And these private central banks have been working behind the scenes with bribes and campaign contributions and other encouragements to steer the course of the nation. But now they've had to break free in the open. The bankers are saying, look, yeah, you might as well get used to it. We're in charge. Your constitution doesn't matter. Your constitutional court doesn't matter. You will agree to the austerity measures we have imposed on you in our desperate search to find that 11th marble. Now, I know a lot of you would like to very much live in the nation that we were all taught we lived in school. It sounded like a really wonderful place, even though it turns out most of us have never actually lived there. But the time has come to ask yourself, if you want to live in a nation that is ruled by private central bankers whose only goal is to make themselves richer, is that a nation you want to live in? Is that a nation you'd be willing to serve in the military of? Is that a nation you'd be willing to see your children blown to bloody bits to support? Pledging allegiance to the dollar instead of the flag. Because that's where we are right now. The private bankers are in charge. And they're not shy about hiding it any longer. Go back to that Alan Greenspan video. The Federal Reserve is answerable to no federal government authority, which is saying the Federal Reserve is now the highest authority. They're not elected. So why are we listening to them? The whole Federal Reserve is unconstitutional anyway. The Money Creation Authority was vested in the United States government by the Constitution and cannot be changed without a constitutional amendment. Back in 1913, the federal government pulled a fast one on the American people. Passed the Federal Reserve Act over Christmas break 1913. Woodrow Wilson signed it because that was the deal he'd made with the bankers to be president. You let me be president, I'll let you have a private central bank again. I know the last two of them almost wrecked the place, but heck, we're going to let this one run 100 years, and by the time it falls apart, we'll all be dead and gone. We're not going to have to deal with that. And, of course, Woodrow Wilson, in his diary some years later, wrote down about how he had unwittingly destroyed his own country by signing that legislation. Now, everyone's talking about Cyprus and where will it fall next, and they're talking up in Italy doing savings account grabs. Possibly Spain. Surprisingly now, Luxembourg is now being looked at as the next ticking time bomb after Cyprus. The contagion is spreading because of that private central bank and that missing 11th marble. And Luxembourg is going to be next. And Bernanke is wrong because of the derivatives sold by Wall Street against Europe's debt. The contagion does have to come here. They can't stop it. This is the downside of globalism. When you tear down those national borders, it's like propping open the fire doors in a building or leaving the hatches open on the watertight bulkheads on a ship. Your first calamity destroys the entire structure. Fire doors contain fires, so you don't lose the whole building, just an office. Watertight bulkheads contain flooding, so you will lose whatever's in that one compartment, but you don't lose the ship as a whole. National borders contain disaster, so you don't lose the entire planetary system. That push for globalism is what turned Wall Street's mortgage-backed security fraud from a national calamity to a global disaster. And they still want more of it. Meanwhile, over in Cyprus, things are so desperate there that Cyprus prison inmates who are working in their equivalent of the prison factories, and they're getting a few euros. They're sending it to their families outside prison instead of going and buying cigarettes and magazines, whatever, at the prison store. That's how desperate it's getting. Now, over in Greece, there was talk of merging the National Bank of Greece and Eurobank Ergasias. And apparently the merger was halted by the government over the weekend, and shares in both banks sank. And the government halted the merger out of a concern that the new merged banks would be so large they would be unmanageable, and if they collapsed as a single unit, would be too big to bail out. So they're running out of options over there. They're running out of options. Again, from Zero Hedge, they're looking at the hyperinflation that is starting to occur in Japan, because Japan is keeping their stock market up the same way the U.S. government is, creating all kinds of new money out of their central bank, pouring into the stock market. And the upshot of it is, according to Kyle Bass, that Japanese retirees are going to lose up to half their life savings due to hyperinflation, if not outright confiscation. Meanwhile, this Japanese overprinting of money to prop up their stock market has infuriated Chinese economists. They're calling the Bank of Japan's decision monetary blackmail, and they're talking about a new currency war retaliation against Japan. So it's just blowing up everywhere. These Ponzi scheme banks are all starting to crumble. They're fighting with each other. And economic wars have a very nasty habit in history of turning into real wars, which we're already seeing. All these U.S. invasions, regime change, covert overthrow, trying to force the world back onto Bretton Woods, and everybody will swear allegiance and fealty to the U.S. Federal Reserve dollar. Countries are breaking away from it faster than they can be conquered. And the cost of all of this economic shenanigans that is making the 1% insanely wealthy is showing up in the general population. Over in Italy, they had a triple suicide. There was this same Italian family. State-imposed austerity measures and mounting debts left them believing there was no way out. So a husband and wife killed themselves, and then on learning of that, the brother of one of them also killed himself. Over in London, there's a story that really tells us about the scam that higher education has become. A graduate with a PhD in physics, 31-year-old, hideously in debt, student loans. The only job he could get was working in a call center. And he jumped off a building to his death. We're seeing that here in the... McDonald's is out there saying you've got to have a bachelor's degree to be a cashier in their restaurants. They're trying to basically create this need for college degrees by saying you need a college degree for very, very menial jobs, to try and keep that system going. Oh, yes, you've got to go to college. If you want to be a cashier at McDonald's, you need a college degree. Here's a student loan. CNBC is reporting the U.S. jobs market is going to get a lot worse. They're issuing warnings to their investors. The trend has started down because when you suck all of the currency into a giant pile over Wall Street in Washington, D.C., and there isn't enough currency in circulation to support commerce, commerce shuts down. And it's incredibly short-sighted that Wall Street and Washington, D.C. seem to think this is a really good thing to do, because the true wealth of a nation begins with the labor of its people. And when you starve the bottom levels of the society for liquidity, and the whole system starts to lock up, well, they can go on fighting with each other over that big pile of money they've got. But there's no new wealth coming into the system. And if there's no new wealth coming into the system, sooner or later, the existing wealth is all absorbed by that constantly growing debt, because every piece of currency in circulation represents a loan at interest from the Federal Reserve, and that interest keeps on accruing even if that dollar is sitting absolutely still and doing nothing. So everybody's all hot and bothered to get a world war really going as a distraction because, hey, that's what worked twice before. Seeing a story over here from Newsmax, U.S. preparing for possible further North Korea actions. A top U.S. military officer said Sunday the Pentagon has bolstered its missile defenses and taken other steps because he can't take the chance North Korea won't soon engage in some military action. With what? What is North Korea going to do to the United States? And what are they going to do it with? North Korea does not have a missile that can reach the U.S. mainland, or Hawaii, or the main part of Alaska. And the last time they tested that long-range missile, the Taepodong 2, it exploded mid-flight. North Korea has tested a nuclear device that they may have bought from Israel. They may be developing nuclear weapons as a deterrent to keep themselves from being invaded. Just because a country has nuclear weapons doesn't mean they're going to attack their neighbors with them. Look how many nations have nuclear weapons. It's not a guarantee of aggression. The only nation to actually use nuclear weapons of mass destruction against the civilians of another country is, of course, the United States. North Korea is not going to attack the United States knowing it would result in nuclear annihilation. This is just the United States government using any excuse they can gin up to get this world war cranked up to distract from the collapse of that Ponzi scheme central bank, just like they did with big mistake number 1 and big mistake number 2. North Korea is the stepping stone for a war with China. And war with China is how the United States is going to end the threat of the gold-backed yuan to the dollar as the international trade and reserve currency. And now that Australia and China have reached an agreement on direct trade without the dollar, that agenda to somehow get a war going with China is going to crank up into high gear. Meanwhile, more and more observers, and this is from 1800politics.com, are basically saying the threat of North Korea is overblown. They're not a threat to us. The United States is the most powerful military in the entire world. Do you really think little tiny North Korea is going to hop in a rowboat and row over here and set off firecrackers under the Golden Gate Bridge? Of course they aren't. And I have a message to all those people out there saying, well, North Korea, they could put together a missile and they could send a nuclear bomb. My parents' generation were forced to pay $5 trillion, and that was back when $1 trillion was really a lot of money, for America's nuclear deterrent. Nuclear ballistic missile submarines, Minuteman missiles in silos in the Midwest, bombers, cruise missiles, all the rest of it. And we spent that money because the government said, if we have all these nuclear weapons, then nobody will attack us. They'll be too afraid. Now, you can't have it both ways. If that nuclear deterrent works, then North Korea is not going to attack us, and we don't need to invade them. If we are actually being threatened by North Korea with their very flaky long-range rocket and their 1 or 2 possible warheads, then that deterrent was a lie. And we, the American people, are owed that $5 trillion as a refund, adjusted for inflation and including accrued interest. You can't have it both ways. You can't spend all this money on the world's largest military machine and then claim little tiny North Korea represents a threat. It just doesn't make any sense. Going to take a break for commercials. We will be right back after these words from our sponsors. 800-313-9443. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And I just got an email from a listener asking for permission to translate my article, All Wars Are Bankers' Wars, into a foreign language. And, of course you have permission. You have permission to take that article, send it anywhere you want, translate it anywhere you want. There is a little Microsoft translator bar at the top of the page. I understand it's not the best translation. But if you want to take that article and translate it and forward it on someplace, please, by all means. You know, it's public domain. I'm putting it out in public domain. Just take it, run with it. And, of course, that's true for pretty much all of my original content at whatreallyhappened.com. If I'm linking to somebody else's copyrighted material, I can't give you permission to use that. But for all my original articles, help yourselves. We're not about money over here, as you can tell by looking at my bank account. We're about trying to get the truth out. We're about trying to head off this world war that all the money junkies see as their best option right now. Going to grab a couple of phone calls here. Russ in Seattle. Aloha, Russ. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Mike, thanks for taking my call. Hey, on Friday, I was on the road by listening to your podcast, and you talked about something that really touched home. In my hometown of Idaho Falls, Idaho, there was an older retired lady that had 3 gals working with her that worked with immigrants, some of them being illegal immigrants that worked on the farms. It's a big farming community. Mm-hmm. And what she did is she contacted the IRS because she was having so many problems with duplicate Social Security numbers, and they weren't checking out and all that. Well, she contacted the IRS and the local authorities about, what was she to do? Well, their answer to that was they raided her.
They raided her?
Yeah, they raided her. They went in with armed agents. I emailed you the article.
I did put that up. And I didn't know the backstory. But so she was the one calling the IRS and complaining about these fraudulent income tax returns. Let me backtrack for the benefit of listeners who weren't hearing the story last week. There is a huge scandal going on where illegal immigrants are using phony Social Security numbers or phony, I think it's called the ITIN number, and they're filing tax returns and claiming this special credit for children. And they're just reaping these, $10,000, $20,000 tax refunds from the IRS, and it's all based on fraud, and it's completely out of control, and the IRS isn't doing anything about it. So now you're telling us that this woman, and if I remember the article correctly, she's running a tax preparation service. She calls the IRS and complains about all the fraud for the illegal immigrants, and the IRS raids her.
Like, to the teeth, came in full battle uniforms, guns drawn, and they broke the window going through and the women that working there were all older bilingual women, none of them under 50. And it just scared the living heck out of those people. And that all they did was try to contact the government to find out what they should do about this issue. And that was the IRS answers to that was to.
Okay, we got to take a break. We got to take a break for station identification. Russ, stick with me. I want to come back to this after the station identification.
Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're talking with Russ in Seattle, and this is follow-on to a story that we were talking about last week, and I just reprised the article to the top of the main page of whatreallyhappened.com. It's talking about this gigantic tax loophole that is allowing illegal aliens, people who are here in this country illegally. The IRS hands out what is called an ITIN number, which is it's an identification number for people who are not allowed to have a Social Security number. And these illegal immigrants are filing these fraudulent tax returns where they'll claim a little tiny amount of earnings, and then they'll invoke this credit for children who may be living still down in Mexico, may not even exist at all. These illegal immigrants are getting $10,000 to $20,000 refunds from the IRS, and the IRS has done nothing about it. And so now Russ in Seattle has sent us a story about a woman who ran a tax preparation agency and was seeing all these identical ITIN numbers coming in and all this fraud. And she calls the IRS to report the fraud, and the IRS raids her with weapons drawn, kick down the door, break the window. What is going on here? Russ, you got anything to add?
Yeah, well, the interesting part of that is a good friend of mine from high school was running as constitutional sheriff against the current sheriff at the time. And so he went and interviewed the woman, as far as what he wanted to bring up on his forum for his candidacy as sheriff. And she told him that, all she wanted to do was not be in trouble herself from all this, identification theft and all this stuff that was going through her office. And they ruined her business. They took a bunch of boxes and boxes of things, and it didn't come out in even the local paper of the reason that they went in there. In addition to that, they didn't check with the local law enforcement when they raided her.
Well, it's interesting. I noticed in the article where it said the IRS is refusing to comment on just why they had done this.
Yeah, and they sealed the search warrant as well. They sealed the search warrant.
They sealed the search warrant, and more to the point here, again, as you say, they didn't inform local law enforcement. They just showed up and did what they did. And again, the point we need to make here, this is a woman who called the IRS to report fraud by illegal immigrants, and the IRS shuts her down.
Yeah.
And again, I'm asking the question, what the heck is going on?
Yeah. Yeah, that was a bad deal. Well, Mike, I appreciate you taking my call. I wanted to make sure you got to both sides of that, and I appreciate you putting it up at what really happened. I love your show and appreciate everything you do. Thanks a lot.
All right, you got it. We're going to switch over to Peter in Los Angeles. Aloha. Peter, welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Peter dropped.
Peter dropped. All right, Corby in Texas. Aloha, Corby. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Mike. How you doing?
Doing fine.
Hey, I served with the 2nd Infantry Division in Korea, 94, 95.
Mm-hmm.
Located on the DMZ, Camp Greaves. It's abandoned now. What I have not heard anybody make a point in any of the news is that North Korea is not going to invade anything in the summer because of all the rice paddies. They're all flooded.
Ah, that's a good
No way
point.
to get
That's a good point.
transportation around. All the training that we did, the majority of it was done in the winter.
Yeah, the ground definitely doesn't support it. Well, I think the United States is looking to perhaps point to North Korea's upcoming test missile firing as a provocation. In fact, there's an interesting story where American politicians are bringing up the sinking of the Cheonan and saying if North Korea sinks another South Korean ship, that will be the reason to go to war. Well, we know that first sinking wasn't North Korea. It's already been proven that that was another hoax, but it could be a false flag like that, at which point the rice paddies don't really matter. Got to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. We've got a caller on the line, Robert in Missouri. Aloha, Robert. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Yeah, I was just listening to Ross, and it brought up so many things in my mind about this program of flooding America with Hispanic illegals. You know, I grew up in Roman Catholicism, and I live in St. Louis, which is a totally Catholic-dominated city, I mean, from top to bottom. And, you know, I'm personally of the mindset that the powers that be, the clergy, the prelates, and the Vatican that control many things here, and organized international Jewry have made agreements to flood this country. They're both for it. I could, give you quotes from both of these groups that they really love this whole idea. And it's just a transfer of wealth to these illegals in order to further balkanize this country.
Well, yeah, certainly, if wealth is, let me cut in here for a second. If wealth is being transferred to the illegals and they're all devout religious Catholics, then it's another way to covertly fund the Catholic Church at a time when they're losing millions and millions of dollars in all these child molestation lawsuits. But I don't think it is confined to that part of society. Clearly, the United States government is setting policy for the illegals. And by the way, before you even get started, I don't want any more of these emails saying, oh, you're just being racist and stuff. No, I'm not. If somebody wants to immigrate to the United States of America, I question their taste at this particular time in history. There is a legal method to become an immigrant, and if you follow that, welcome, join our society, have fun, and so forth. We're talking about people who, by their very presence here, have committed a crime, and a federal government that is simply looking the other way, and more to the point, is just shoveling taxpayer-funded resources at people who are not really supporting the system. And I understand part of the agenda there is all of these illegals, if they get amnesty and they're allowed to vote, and many of them already do in areas where ID checks are not required, they tend to vote Democratic. I understand that the military recruiters are already down there saying if you will sign up and serve a tour in wherever it is we're invading next week, you will get a green card when it's all over. And, of course, corporate America certainly loves the flood of very inexpensive labor coming into the country because it drives wages and salaries down and corporate profits back up. So I don't think we should point the finger just at the Catholic Church or just at one particular group. A lot of overlapping agendas are at work here. But it does come down to the fact that any nation does have a right to control its own borders and to decide who comes in and who does not. And in the case of this wide-open border with Mexico, many of these people coming across the border are not only criminals just for stepping across the border without the appropriate paperwork, they are criminals who, are fleeing Mexico because they don't want to go to jail. And they come up here. We saw the same thing with all the Cuban refugees who came to Florida when they were allowed to come up there. They brought a lot of crime with them. and it's not being racist or exclusionary to say that if somebody wants to come to this country, they should conform to the laws of the land.
I agree.
Okay.
I was just mentioning the power blocks that are bringing this to bear. This is a win-win-win for everybody but the regular old American, and that's
absolutely
what the funny
true.
thing is.
But
Yeah,
again, going back to this idea of the North American Union that they've been trying to sell for some time, the borders cannot legally officially be dropped until everybody in the United States and Mexico and Canada is living the same standard of living, which means not pulling Mexico up, but pulling Canada and the United States down. So that...
Exactly. Hey, and check this out. And if you look at the currency trends of all three countries, guess where they've been going? They've been getting right on line with each other.
Yes, they have.
That's what a lot of people aren't. They're not paying attention to that. How the Canadian dollar and our dollar is almost exact, and now the peso has come up. Heck, I was in the Marine Corps back in the late 80s, early 90s. You know how many pesos you got for $1?
It was pretty amazing.
Hundreds. Yeah, and now you get 10 or 11, pesos for $1. So this North American Union is happening. Here's what I think is funny. All these Mexican, I would call them dupes. They're coming into this open air prison called the United States, and guess what? The door's going to get shut, and guess what? They're going to be hating life just like all the rest of us. And that's what the real bummer is. There's going to be so many of these people that flood here, the whole thing's going to collapse, and then they're going to be stuck like Chuck here in the United States open air prison.
Well, it's definitely, as you say, it is good for so many agendas except for the ordinary American people. And again, the issue here isn't whether these illegals are coming from Mexico or Honduras or from China or Japan or whatever. They are illegals when they step across our border without the appropriate paperwork. And that is the issue. And, of course, all of these so-called advocacy groups for the immigrants, they're trying to scrape, you just hate Mexicans and stuff. They're learning the public relations from Israel. We're not doing anything wrong. You just hate the Mexicans. And it's not really working very well.
Well, and that's just pathetic that Americans could actually ever be brainwashed to think that way, to think that by breaking laws, people can come here no matter what they look like, and that's somehow a positive. Any other country, I mean, look at Mexico's southern border. These people, they run a tight ship down there, letting Guatemalans and the rest come up through their system, but then they want their northern border with us to be just wide open, and that's the duplicity of the Mexican government and the people that control them.
I think if you want to be fair about immigration, the United States should have an immigration policy identical to that of Mexico itself. You can't just walk into Mexico and get a job and huge tax refunds and a free cell phone and free medical care and all the rest of that. If you walk across the border into Mexico without the appropriate piece of paper, they will throw you in prison. And we should be doing exactly the same.
Right. All right, Mike. Keep doing the good work, man. See ya.
Thanks an awful lot. We're going to switch over to George in Texas. Aloha, George. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
How you doing, Mike?
Doing good.
Yesterday I did a rare thing. I went to church, and I went and confronted a pastor because he was a 511c3 church, and I finally told the pastor, I said, you can't serve two masters.
Mm-hmm.
You can't serve the IRS and the Almighty himself, and he just got very uncomfortable because he basically said, if I talk about that, I'll offend some people in my congregation. And I just basically said, you got a moral obligation to expose corruption. Because, he's one of those people that you don't talk about politics in the pew or anything like that. And it's like, it's coming down. We always asked our pastors, people who go to church, they cannot serve two masters.
Well, first of all, he could have come back and said, render unto God that which is God's and render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, which is a convenient out. But the reality is, under a 501c3, churches are not allowed to be political. Many of them are, and a lot of churches abused that principle back when Bush was in office. Remember the faith-based initiative where all this taxpayer money was going to religious institutions, which then promptly started supporting the pro-war, pro-conquest, spread the Holy Crusade to the rest of the world agenda. So, there's a lot of shenanigans and skullduggery going on inside those churches, and I'm over and above the molestation issue.
Well, we got good news, Mike, too. MSNBC or Melissa Harris Perry.
Mm-hmm.
You know you got higher ratings than her show.
I do. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, good MSNBC, they got the most dismal ratings. And I'm surprised some people in the Patriot community are taking her seriously, saying the kids belong to the state, the kings belong to the state. I think that's why people are not watching that.
Well, we ran that story to poke fun at her and everything like that. You know, I'm amazed. I didn't even know I had ratings. You know, so but yeah, it is, and they're pushing that whole collectivist agenda. Where and it's basically it's an attack on homeschooling. It's an attack on parental influence as a whole. That your children belong to the community and the state, and therefore you are obligated to only teach your own children what the state wishes you to teach them. And of course, that is dictatorship.
Well, but it's just the thing is, it's more like I just think we ought to take a different approach. We shouldn't be broadcasting it, reporting this in a way that gives it life unto its own. We ought to be discrediting her for her statement. And just,
I don't think we need to. I don't think we need to. I certainly know on our readership on whatreallyhappened.com, when they read that statement by her, they're going to say, this is absurd. And we don't need to hammer that point.
Well, I just told her, I sent an email, so I said, no wonder you got dismal ratings. I said, because people don't want to hear your crap. Okay. Which is true.
Yeah.
But that's why they're getting no ratings. People are tired of hearing this crap on the air.
Well, we know that right now the majority of Americans are, in fact, getting their political news from here in the independent media and the blogosphere, and the trend is only going to increase from here because the corporate media is being constrained from changing their behavior, both by their corporate owners and, of course, by the various COINTELPRO and Mockingbird assets in executive positions. And as long as they refuse to change how they're reacting as the world changes around them, sooner or later they are going to go extinct. And they're fighting tooth and nail to find some way to demonize the blogs and the independent media. They're still sending out chemtrails and HAARP and alien UFOs and all this other nonsense in a desperate bid to find some way they can ridicule or embarrass the alternative media, so that the independent media rather, so that the corporate media can recapture the audience. I notice they're already starting to launch up again about predators online, and you should never let your kids go online. There's cyberbullying this and, sexual predator, whatever. And it's just a constant stream of scare tactics. And I notice, very interesting, I just put up this article from the Guardian, where they're now saying that North Korea's attack on the United States might be a cyber attack that shuts down the Internet, which would dovetail very nicely with the U.S. escalating the war and silencing the independent media all at the same time. Got to take a break for commercials. Thank you for the call, George. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. And I just got an email from a listener saying that he didn't understand why the rice paddies being flooded would be an issue for North Korea trying to invade South Korea. Well, it's very, very simple. Wars are not conducted only along the paved roads. Look at the history of World War II across Europe. They were going through fields and forests and meadows. And when you have rice paddies that are flooded, it impedes the ability of your mechanized vehicles to make progress. They can bog down. It's just a giant mud hole is what it is. And so, yes, in point of fact, the fact that this is the time of year when the rice paddies are being flooded for the rice crop, North Korea would be forced to use major roads and highways going towards the demilitarized zone, and of course those are open invitations to airstrikes. So yeah, it is a factor. It definitely is a factor. Now, as I mentioned to that last caller, Senator Lindsey Graham is out there, or was out there on Meet the Press, saying major war with North Korea is possible. And he said, if a South Korean naval vessel is sunk this year, as has happened in the past, I think the new president of South Korea would be compelled to act. Okay? Now, the problem is, basically, Graham has told us a potential false flag. Because what he's referring to is the sinking of the South Korean ship, the Cheonan. And we talked about that last week. South Korea was having a naval exercise, and all of a sudden in the middle of it, the Cheonan was hit with a torpedo, and it sank. Horror of horrors, it had to be North Korea. And, of course, nobody could come up with a reason why North Korea, which has had bad luck with their submarines, they're missing 2 of them right now, would sail all the way down there into the middle of a military exercise, pop off a torpedo at a ship, and then skedaddle on out. And they dredged up the remains of the torpedo, and they showed it on TV saying, see, this is a North Korean torpedo. And they had the blueprint of a North Korean torpedo next to it, and anybody that knows anything about mechanics could look at the two and realize that the blueprint and the recovered torpedo were not the same device. The most obvious difference being that the tail fin actuators were on the opposite side of the rear bulkhead for the tail cone. So it was not the same torpedo. The torpedo that was recovered was eventually identified as a German export model that North Korea does not buy, but that is deployed on those Dolphin-class submarines the people of Germany have been forced to give to Israel. And so they sort of backed off on that. But now Lindsey Graham is out there saying, oh, yes, it had to be North Korea. They could do it again. So he's basically waving around a potential false flag. They're looking for something that can happen. They can blame on North Korea to get this war going. Because for all of his bluff and bluster, Kim Jong-un is not actually going to attack the United States or Japan because he knows he cannot win the resulting war. Period. End of discussion. We're going to see a false flag, whether that's another South Korean ship being torpedoed or a missile hitting Guam or possibly even here in Hawaii. Or as we're seeing from the British press now, they're saying North Korea will launch a cyber attack against the United States. They're really desperate to get this war with North Korea going because the U.S. sees that as a stepping stone to getting to war with China. And the goal for war with China is very simple. To politically and most importantly economically isolate China so China's gold-backed yuan is no longer a threat to the dollar as the international trade and reserve currency. That's what all of our kids in uniform are dying for, to preserve the dollar's rule of international commerce. Now, whether or not China is going to back North Korea or what they will do is a very, very complex issue. We're seeing this story from the Trenches World Report saying China signals it will back North Korea in war. We know that China has been mobilizing military resources to their border with North Korea. Whether they plan on coming south and joining in the fight, I don't think so. Or whether they're there to simply stem a flood of North Korean refugees from pouring into China sounds more likely to me. Now, we know China and North Korea are friends and allies, but China has been siding with the U.S. at the United Nations. They went along with sanctions. They are at least publicly saying that they think North Korea is behaving badly. Now, as the counter-argument to that, of course, is that in that part of the world, your honor is a far more important factor than it is here in the United States of America. Here in the United States of America, people are just sort of used to the fact that politicians lie and treaties get broken. It's a little different over there in Asia, where your word is seen as who you are. And while China probably realizes that the U.S. aggressions against North Korea are an attempt to bait China into a war, China is going to be seriously considering, after years of friendship with North Korea, if they fail to aid North Korea, they will lose face. Their honor will be harmed. I'm sure that there are other factors coming into that, but it is a factor. And that's why it's very, very difficult to accurately predict what China will do in this circumstance. Now, down in Mali, France has launched their biggest offensive so far. 1,000 troops sweep in to attack a rebel stronghold, which just happens to be located near one of those gold mines. We'll be back after these words from our sponsors. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're going to go back to the phones. Pat in Texas. Aloha, Pat. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind today?
Well, a lot. I was just wondering if you guys couldn't get on in Dallas-Fort Worth again. There's a spot where they took Alice Jones off, and I kind of think he thinks they paid him off to take him off. Well, if you got on, they'd get more money to take you off.
I'll tell John to do that. Go around to all the big stations and say, put us on the air. They'll bribe you lots of money to take us off. Well, I appreciate it, and I'm sorry we're not on the air in Dallas-Fort Worth any longer. But the reality is, through the Internet, we're reaching a huge audience. There's the live streams from Republic Broadcasting.
My computer's down.
Oh, well, that's a problem. And
I want to ask you a question.
Sure.
Republic Broadcasting one time sold me 2 hours worth of the Waco 9/11 tapes.
Mm-hmm.
They gleaned out of 8 hours of 9/11 calls. Do you still do that? Do they still do that? Do you know?
You're going to have to go to republicbroadcasting.org, and you're going to have to email them because I'm out here in Hawaii doing whatreallyhappened.com, and I do my radio show, but I have very, very little connection with the internal workings of Republic Broadcasting, so you're going to have to take that question to them.
Well, what I was upset about was we had a drive-by shooting here in our neighborhood last night, and I wonder how many of those are going on around the country. I don't know if you were around when they were talking about MJTF police, I think it's multi-jurisdictional task force police, and they put the guy that started the whole thing in jail. And started talking about it. Mark, suddenly I forgot his name.
Okay, well, probably not worth remembering, but a point I'd like to make here.
It was worth remembering because, see, the police are in on that, and they hired the gangs to do that kind of stuff. If they want more money, they why did they send ATF to Waco? Why didn't they send DEA if they're worried about a drug lab?
Well, the drug lab was gone. The drug lab was gone when David Koresh took over that church. He called the local sheriff's department and said, I've just taken control here. There's a drug lab on the premises. Please take it away. And
I tell you what I would like to do. You know, I'd like to hear the guy from North Korea, his own mouth, saying all the things they said he said. Because if anybody says I said anything, I said, if you don't see my mouth moving, don't believe it.
Good advice.
I don't see your mouth move, and I'm not going to take nobody else's word for it. And I just know what I saw, and I know that we've lost our freedom. We've lost our freedom of religion. If they don't like that kind of religion, too bad. They didn't prove anything they set out to prove. The only thing they did is try to scare people into selling guns or different races living together, because you can't have a race war on the street now if races live together.
Well, that's definitely. It's the U.S. government loves to divide and conquer. Back during the 1960s, they had COINTELPRO was deliberately angering the whites against the black. 1990s, they had the women against the men. Now they're trying to push rich against the poor. That one's failing because there are so few rich and everybody else is poor. Pat, got to let you go here. Thank you very much for the phone call.
I don't think if Fox wants to cry in their beer over what happened to Connecticut with an average house price of $500,000, they should be crying in their beer when Waco coming up here on 418 for poor kids.
Yes, absolutely. When we get closer to that, we're going to be talking about Waco. And by the way, the reason the FBI took over was because Waco was started by the BATF, which had a botched raid. They were trying to get some favorable press because they were under severe criticism. And then, of course, all the evidence from Waco just happened to be in the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City when that got blown up. And that basically ended all the U.S. government investigations into what had happened at Waco, Texas. Got to let you go, Pat. And we're going to switch over to John in Virginia. Aloha, John. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Oh, hey, Mike. Not to be redundant here, but first of all, I want to thank you for your perseverance, and I have great respect and admiration for you. And also for the callers to the show. I think it almost seems like I know a lot of them as much as I know you. And I've learned so much from everybody in the discussion. You were speaking about Lindsey Graham.
Yes.
It almost seems like he's telling us, just like everybody knew the day 9/11 happened, that it was bin Laden. You know, it had already been implanted in the public mind, and the conclusion came automatically for many people. People I knew, the first words out of their mouth, like they'd been prepped. And here's Lindsey Graham. It seems very much like he's basically telling us it's his dream come true. And you were speaking about these torpedoes. And, if you analyze them, somebody, halfway knowledgeable would recognize that there's issues here. It doesn't add up. remember the aluminum tubes everybody was crying about? They were anodized aluminum tubes, and you couldn't use an anodized aluminum tube for a centrifuge. They were, or they had something to do with, they were for something else.
Yeah, that's true. The anodization actually weakens the metal. And actually, if you're talking about Iraq, they were trying to claim that the anodized aluminum tubes were for missile bodies, but the same thing applies there. The anodized aluminum is structurally weaker than just polished or painted aluminum. And again, there was no evidence that these, it's just a tube. It's a metal tube. You could say, oh, it's going to be a pipe. It's going to be a merry-go-round. It's going to be whatever. But it's just this constant thing, oh, they could turn this into something evil. And that's a really poor excuse to go to war. But apparently it's the only excuse they've got.
Yeah, precisely. And I knew you'd be able to fill in those gaps. Another thing, I do believe that the time is now right. And thanks a lot to people like you that have really stuck out there and kept it at a good, even keel. But I do think the time is right for the public. The public is now ready to absorb good, reasoned, rational presentations of facts.
Yes.
And absorb them. I don't think that it's necessary now for the in-your-face attacks and stuff. I mean, I was involved in a blog where I did a lot of that. But I thought it was because of the times it needed to be done. But I think that the approach, guys like you are doing, where it's the steady, even keel now, the public is now awake enough to absorb the information being delivered, and they can digest it, process it, and then act accordingly and rationally, with who we're going to support here. And I really admire you a lot for that, and I wish more people were doing it.
Well, I think you're right. It is a trend. Now, you need to understand in the early days when this was all just getting started, there was a lot of abuse and vitriol on the blogs, much of which was being created by government-paid propagandists who would go into the blogs and try and stir up trouble in order to delay the formation of a popular consensus, in order to distract from the facts that were being presented. But you're correct. Over the last 20 years, we have seen the public become much more skeptical of the official story on anything, like that Pat in Texas was saying. If I don't see their lips moving, I'm not going to accept what it is we're being told that they're saying. And one of the important things about being in the independent media is you have to be able to judge your audience in terms of what they're ready to hear and listen to and understand. And you want to be as close to that edge as you can, but you don't want to go over, because then they'll throw up their hands and say, oh, you're being ridiculous, and their old defense mechanisms and their old brainwashing will kick in, and you will lose them. So that's one of the skills of being in the independent media, is knowing and sensing what your audience is ready to hear.
Yeah. Mike, I wanted to say, I don't want to get too personal about, I don't mean with you, but people I know. There are very heroic individual acts of dissent being done, and I know a personal friend of mine. I called her up and I just told her how much I admire her. Making her wear a mask in the hospital every day because she didn't take those flu shots. It's almost like the scarlet letter.
Yes.
And I mean every day. It's ridiculous. You could tell that it is intended to humiliate and to belittle, to single out, and to make an example of. And she's sticking with it, and I don't know if she listens to the show, but she's out there.
Good for her.
I admire her greatly. Yeah, very much.
And it is silly. It is silly, because if everybody around her has had the vaccine, why does she need to wear a mask? Because she can't infect anybody around her.
Right. It's absurd. And these are medical people at the hospital.
Well, medical people are basically, they're part of that system. The medical schools brainwash them into thinking, oh, yes, whatever's wrong with the patient, prescribe a pill, prescribe a treatment. And they get very defensive about that. I've talked to, we used to have a friend here on Oahu who was a nurse, and we would try to bring up some of the harmful effects of vaccines and how some vaccines don't actually do any good. She got very defensive because that was her job, administering vaccines at the hospital.
Yeah. I think a lot of them that really, they start to see it or they hear it somewhere, their friend will tell them, or they'll see the effects in their kids. I think they're not, thanks to places like whatreallyhappened.com, I think it's spreading.
Yes.
Slowly, you got to take it easy in certain areas, but I really do see that once that acknowledge that the acknowledgement in the media is so important for the mind of the public and then the individual, and it really is seeping in there, Mike. I mean, guys like you that have hung in there, I just have the greatest respect and admiration for you.
Thank you very much for that. Yeah, I have to be very honest. When I first ventured into this all those years ago after Vince Foster got murdered, I had no idea I was still going to be doing it almost 20 years later. And I was very naive. I believed the official story of everything. It's just that the photo they put out, Vince Foster and the gun, just could not be believed. And I just shared it with some friends, and some people from CNN overheard me, and the next thing I knew, my career had evaporated. And that was kind of what put me on this path. It's certainly, if somebody, back in high school when they're talking career day, what do you want to grow up to be? I want to grow up to be a peace activist, an enemy of the White House, and talk show host, would never have occurred to me. Back in high school, I had ambitions of being a professional astronomer for my entire life. And so it has been a very, very long time. It's gone on far longer than I expected it to, but we are, as they say, decisively engaged, because right now we're at the point where the money junkies are looking at a brand new world war as their best solution to all of their problems, and I would very much like to prevent that from happening. And so we're just going to stick with it as long as we can. All right?
Education is everything. Thanks, Mike.
You got it. Going to switch over to Mike in New York. Aloha, Mike. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Yeah, no, I don't want to take much time. I just want to revert back to a couple callers previously who talked about the 501c3, and I just wanted to mention that there must be, between other shows like yours or others, that people are catching on to that, because for the first time that I can ever remember, there was October 7th of 2012, so many 100 pastors came in a thing called Pulpit Freedom Sunday. And it was supposed to be they were to talk about, in protest of the IRS's controversial tax code, which prohibits them from talking about legislation on any kind of, or legislation or candidates, anything like that. So obviously somewhere along the line there are people that are going up to their pastors and questioning, what's the story with this 501c3? Because when you look at it, it basically said that before that, when they married someone, they would say, by the power and invest me of Almighty God, and I pronounce you man and wife. When they signed the 501c3, it became, now by the power and invest me in Almighty God and the state of.
Mm-hmm.
So it obviously changed things a bit, and I think a lot of them don't have answers to that, but that was the first time that I thought to myself, there must be a lot of people now approaching their pastors, because I've never heard of anything, and I don't know if anything ever became of it, but they did have a thing called Pulpit Freedom Sunday where the pastors were supposed to go against this IRS ruling and talk about the election and who you can vote for or not. Now, I don't know what happened to that or what came about, but I know because of shows like this, there must be something where people are now finally going up to these guys and saying, hey, if you're what you say you are, how do you explain this?
That is certainly happening. And also need to point out, I know we talk about those members of the clergy who are abusing their positions of trust and power. They're attacking the little kids. They're embezzling their own church funds and so forth. But that, of course, is not the uniformity of what's going on out there. And obviously, at the religious institutions my wife is involved in, they're very cool people. They're getting out in the community. They're feeding the hungry. They're trying to make life better for those around them. And obviously, that's something we can get behind and support. And I know from some of the discussions I've had with some of these people, they share the concerns that everybody else does about the rush to war. And some of them are constrained by the awareness that members of their congregation are in the military, because we have the highest per capita presence of military bases of any state in the United States. And they're trying to, please the whole congregation and not alienate people. But in private, yeah, they know what's going on, and they're very, very concerned about it as well. And so I imagine that this Free Pulpit Sunday wasn't just parishioners and congregants coming up and talking to the clergy. It's the clergy themselves saying, really, at some point, we have to make that choice between what we're being told to do by the government and what our faith and our moral principles tell us we should be doing. And I know a lot of clergy are very trapped in that, but they're not comfortable with it by any stretch of the imagination.
Okay, thanks.
All right, we're going to switch over to Kent in Virginia. Aloha, Kent. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
You were talking about the aluminum tubes and the old dual-use scam. I happen to have lived in Europe at the time of the first Gulf War, and I would watch the BBC. And one of the most amazing things that I will never forget, they had like a program on the day in the BBC sometimes where they would have comments in the House of Parliament, or and there was an investigation where somebody who was manufacturing pipes was hauled in for to discuss what happened. He talked about being visited by a quote-unquote spook about the contract that he had been given, the export license for pipes for Saddam Hussein.
Mm-hmm.
And what they were trying to do was drum up this story that these pipes that were intended for like an oil pipeline could also be made to make a giant gun.
You're talking Gerald Bull's super gun. Well, in point of fact, Gerald Bull did do that. The sections of pipe for that gun were contracted out as sections of an oil pipeline, but the people making it understood from the extreme precision and tolerances demanded that it wasn't really for an oil pipeline. This was a program. The U.S. was funding it for Saddam Hussein. Israel didn't like it because they were concerned that once Saddam Hussein used that gun on Iran, that he would simply turn it around and use it on Israel, and that's why Gerald Bull was assassinated. The issue is, though, there are some things where you can say it's dual use and others where it's just absurd to say so. And the super gun components, of course, were not aluminum. They were gun barrel steel. We got to take a break for commercials. Thank you for the call. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And I think I had another caller here, but it scrolled off the top of my little text screen. Do we have a caller, Manny? I guess not. All righty, moving right along to the war zones here. Over in Syria, terrorist bombing rocks crowded area in Damascus, 14 people killed, 146 injured. And this again tells us what's going on in Syria is not a true popular revolution. It's a covert attempt at overthrow. The Free Syria Army is using terror tactics against the general population. Think American Revolution. Would it have made sense for George Washington and Thomas Jefferson to go into, say, Boston Commons and set off a bomb and kill a bunch of people? No, it wouldn't. A popular revolution, a true popular revolution, needs the support of the general public to oust the offending government. And so when the Free Syria Army is engaging in these tactics, they're proclaiming to the world they're hired mercenaries. They're to overthrow the government. They don't represent the people of Syria. 95% of the Free Syria Army are not Syrian. They're from other countries, including the United States. Now, Assad, who has recently made a rare TV appearance, possibly to quell all those rumors about his being killed by an Iranian bodyguard, he's come out there and say that basically the Syria crisis is going to mark the end of a unipolar world where the Western governments and Western banks are dominating the globe. And he says we're going to see the rise of BRICS as a global political and financial power. And I think he's right. This Western banking system is self-destructing. It's a Ponzi scheme. And every Ponzi scheme in history, sooner or later, it implodes. It can't be otherwise. So the system is dying, and unfortunately in its death throes, it's striking out at other countries, potentially with nuclear weapons. Meanwhile, over in Russia, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov is saying that in any dealings with Iran, the first step is to recognize Iran's rights under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And he is absolutely correct. Both the United States and Iran have signed the NNPT. Israel has not. Side note. Under international law, the United States is obligated to recognize Iran's right to nuclear power and other peaceful uses of nuclear technology. Medical isotopes, industrial destaticers, large structure X-ray machines. Under Article 4 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the United States is obligated to help Iran build those peaceful nuclear facilities, which is a great way to make sure they are peaceful nuclear facilities, if that were the real agenda. by refusing to comply with Article 4, it's the U.S. that's in violation of international law, not Iran. Got to take a break for station identification. We'll be right back. And aloha, welcome back to hour number 3 of our show. And Dan the Man is now sitting in our control room answering the phones when you call in to 800-313-9443, 800-313-9443. Now, following up on the still on the back burner attempt to start a war with Iran, to force Iran's oil to be sold only for the dollars, there is an interesting comment from Franklin Lamb over at mycatbirdseat.com where he's basically saying that the anti-Iran sanctions are basically null and void. International law is overwhelmingly on the side of Iran. And he's absolutely correct for the same reason that Russia's deputy foreign minister is correct. The United States signed a treaty with Iran recognizing Iran's right to peaceful nuclear technology. Under that treaty, the United States is also obligated to help Iran build those peaceful nuclear facilities. And it's a really good way to make sure they are peaceful. If you're going in there to their power station and you're laying pipes and helping with the welding and pouring the concrete, then you know there is no clandestine bomb factory hidden underneath like Israel has under their reactor at Dimona, and like Israel claimed Iraq had at the Osirik power station before they bombed it. And of course, after the invasion, inspectors went in, looked at the ruins of Iraq's power station, and they found it was just a power station. We're going to be getting into this a little bit later. Is Israel getting ready to do something unilateral? Because they've been screaming, Iran is a threat, Iran is a threat. Netanyahu was out there when he was a part of the Holocaust commemoration or Holocaust sales pitch in Israel. He was out there saying Israel reserves the right to unilaterally strike Iran. So they could go ahead and do it, shower the whole region with radioactivity from that ruined reactor. Meanwhile, Russia continues to send some very unmistakable signals to the United States. They are carrying out exercises with their backfire bombers, simulating firing air-launched cruise missiles at Aegis ships, the same ones that the United States has now deployed near Japan in this run-up to whatever it is going to do with North Korea. Now, I do not know the current state of the Russian air-launched cruise missiles. I do know that the Aegis ship's defenses against cruise missiles center on the phalanx, close-in weapon system, these little radar-controlled robotic Gatling guns. Kind of looks like R2-D2 with a tube sticking out from one side. If these Russian cruise missiles can maneuver, if they can weave back and forth, if they can dipsy-doodle, if they're potentially radar stealthy, if they're carrying radar jammers, they can get through the phalanx. They can get through the phalanx by simply launching more cruise missiles than the Aegis ships have Gatling guns to deal with. So Russia's already practicing to deal with this. They're sending a message. This dollarification program has gone on long enough. The world does not want to go back to Bretton Woods. The world does not want to go back to dependence on the dollar internationally and the predations of the Federal Reserve that resulted therefrom. This is all about the currency. It's all about the money. It's not terrorism. It's not they hate us for our freedoms. It's about forcing the world to use the U.S. government's fiat paper currency. Going to take a break for a commercial. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. And over the weekend, we saw the beginnings of a new propaganda campaign. This is over at Associated Press. Anti-Semitic incidents surged in 2012. Israeli researchers warned Sunday of a sudden upsurge in anti-Semitic attacks. Yada, yada, yada. Blah, blah, blah. Hitler, blah, blah, blah. Nazis, Holocaust, blah, 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 blah. When they start waving anti-Semite around, it means Israel's about to attack someone, and wants to remind the world of Israel's eternal victim status as political cover. It's become an all too familiar pattern. Before they go into Lebanon, oh, anti-Semitism, the world hates us, we're poor victims. Before they went into Lebanon, they did the same thing. Before they went into Gaza, twice. And especially given Netanyahu's comments when he was, Netanyahu was at this commemoration at the Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial Center. Netanyahu was out there saying Israel reserves the right to act against Iran's nuclear program. It's the same rhetoric we heard before Israel flew up and bombed Iraq's civilian nuclear power station. Oh, we can't let them have nukes. They'll do bad things with it. No, they were actually making electricity. That's all it was. It's a power station. Because these nations in the Middle East understand the oil will not last forever. And it makes more sense to sell the oil to other countries than to burn it up themselves. And that's why they're embracing nuclear power. Little switch on the wall. Flip it up, light goes on. Flip it down, light goes off. That's what they're working on. Nuclear electrical power generation. And Israel screamed, Iraq is making bombs in their reactor. And they destroyed the power station. And following the invasion of Iraq, inspectors visited the remains of the Osirik power station, and all they found was the ruins of a power station. No bomb factory at all. Then Israel did exactly the same thing into Syria. And again, no evidence that there were any nuclear weapons or any of anything. Israel's batting zero at finding clandestine nuclear weapons anywhere in the Middle East, other than their own, which they were caught trying to sell to South Africa. And so we shouldn't be listening to them now about Iran. But I would not be surprised if Netanyahu, who is so desperate to get America into a war against Iran, might haul off and attack Iran's nuclear power station, just like they did with Iraq. And then they'll skedaddle back to Israel and they say, please, Mr. American government, send your children to defend us against the Iranian hordes, which they do time and again. All right, we're going to grab a phone call. Carrie in Florida. Aloha, Carrie. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Well, thank you, Michael. Yes, that's one of the, I know you're not the type to take accolades, but you're one of the only, you and John, are one of the only to speak of Israel and their role in global politics, global war. And I know enough about the sordid history of Zionism to be very, very dangerous. I've only read a couple publications, a couple books, and other whatnot. But people are so afraid. Like you tell it like it is, carefully.
Yes.
Tell it like it is. People should not be afraid to walk on eggshells. The Zionists are murderers. And they're not afraid to tell you if you read their writings. And that's really all I had to say, Michael, and just thank you for speaking what I believe is the truth anyway. It makes sense in my worldview from what I've read. And I studied world government. I woke up in 95. I was very active in the John Birch Society until I just got so tired of the sheeple, unable to wake up. And I basically quit after 10 years, and then I discovered what I think is a real root of everything, and, history. We know who did Russia, we know who did China, so anyway, that's really all I had to say, and I want to thank you for standing up, okay?
Okay, well, thank you very much for the kind words, and we know that Israel has a tremendous influence not only on the American government, but on the American corporate media. And you're absolutely right. If you go over and read the writings of the Israelis themselves, the Israeli government, they're openly admitting what they're doing. They just don't want anybody else to talk about it. In a lot of ways, it's like the Catholic Church, where if you read the Catholic Church's own documents, they know there's been a problem with child sexual molestation going back 1,400 years. They just don't want anybody else to talk about it. And it's kind of an interesting thing that would bring this up right now, because we're hearing from almonitor.com where the brand new Israeli government that Netanyahu finally formed a coalition is going to be the most ardent supporter of the illegal settlements in the West Bank of any Israeli government. They're going to be sending in the bulldozers. They're basically going to be expanding the settlements and telling the Palestinians, look, God says that we can take this land, you need to get out. And that, of course, is going to increase the friction. And in fact, corollary to that, Israel shoots down U.S. proposal for concessions to Palestinians. This is a major international slap in the face to John Kerry because he was over there trying to get the talks between Israel and Palestine to start up again. And the first thing he said is, you've got to give the Palestinians some place to live. And Israel says, that is unacceptable. They're back to their classic negotiating position. Palestine must give us everything we want first. Then maybe we'll do something nice for them. And that is, of course, a negotiating position designed to fail. The biggest one that's going on is Israel demands Palestine recognize Israel's right to exist, which sounds reasonable until you realize Israel has never officially drawn their borders. And so if Palestine recognizes Israel's right to exist, they're falling into a trap, because then Israel can turn around and say, well, all of this is Israel, so you need to get out. And all of this misery, all of this war, all of this unhappiness could have been avoided if Israel would simply grant to Palestine that which Israel demands for itself, a right to exist. If Israel were to say, Palestine has a right to exist, all of these problems would go away the next day. But way back when the United Nations came up with the partition plan, where they said, we're going to take Palestine, we're going to take part of Palestine away from the Palestinians and make the new nation of Israel, and Israel said, no, we want it all. And Israel took the attitude of, we have a right to exist, God gave us this land, and the rest of you have to get out. There's no such thing as Palestinians, you don't have a right to exist. And that is, of course, when the rest of the Arab nations are around there saying, well, if you're not going to recognize Palestine has a right to exist, we're not going to recognize your right to exist. And that's been the impasse for going on almost 70 years now. All Israel has to do to settle this down is simply give to Palestine that which Israel is demanding for itself. Israel says Palestine has a right to exist. Palestine says Israel has a right to exist. And by the way, Palestine has stated multiple times they will recognize Israel when Israel recognizes Palestine. So who is it who's really standing in the way of a peaceful resolution here? Now, there is continuing fallout over this scandal, or this story, about Ben Zigir, who was a Mossad agent who wound up supposedly committing suicide in an Israeli jail. But it's highlighted once again of Israel's abuse of Australian passports. Australia is one of the nations that allows dual citizenship, where you can be a citizen of Israel and have an Israeli passport, and you can be a citizen of Australia and have an Australian passport. And Israel goes down to Australia, and they'll recruit the dual citizens to travel the world carrying out missions for the Mossad on their Australian passports to conceal Israel's hand in what's going on. And it's caused a great deal of diplomatic friction between Israel and Australia, also Israel and New Zealand. They were trying the same scam down there. And Israel and Canada. Canada has complained many times about Mossad carrying out operations using Canadian passports. And we can presume that because the United States also allows dual citizens, that there are Mossad agents traveling the world on American passports carrying out Israel's will. Now, John Kerry has hit another major roadblock up in Turkey. He's trying to get Turkey and Israel to make friends and make nice so they can get on with the business of conquering Syria. And as you're probably already aware, Turkey came out in the wake of Israel's sort of grudging apology over killing the aid workers on the humanitarian flotilla. And the families of all those people who were killed said it's not a meaningful apology until Israel lifts the blockade on Gaza. And the Turkish government took the exact same position. And they're saying the apology doesn't mean anything. If Israel wants to be friends with Turkey, Israel has to lift the Gaza blockade. Of course, Israel will not do that. Good for Turkey, and it's a major diplomatic blow to U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry. He's not doing very well heading on out there. All righty, we're going to grab a quick phone call. Vince in Indiana. Aloha, Vince. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, aloha, Brother Michael. Hey, got a question here.
Sure.
This is in regards to as far as the way our government. Well, we all know it. We got a tyrant government. It's been proven before our eyes over and over. But when you say that, and I hope you're right when you say that. It looks like there's going to be a collapse the way the Soviet Union collapsed.
Mm-hmm.
If that does happen, Michael, what are we going to have to do?
Okay, I will answer that when we come back from these words from our sponsors. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're talking with Vince in Indiana. And Vince, you ask a very important question. What are we going to do, knowing that the Federal Reserve Ponzi scheme has to collapse and will likely take the federal government with it? And
it's not the whole question. I didn't finish the question.
Okay.
What are we going to do to keep the same government from forming and doing it all over again? In other words, the same tyrants taking over. What are we going to do to prevent that?
Well, again, that is the important question here, because we need to be right now planning on that new nation that will rise here when the old government is gone. We can look to the Russian republics as a good model. They had a few months of confusion they had to get through. They formed the Russian republics. They kicked out their money junkies. They've taken control of their central bank. And we need to, all of us, be working on the blueprint for the new America right now, in which we come up with ways to keep these bad things from happening. I think the original Constitution is a good framework to start with, and the amendments up until Amendment 13. Obviously, in light of new technological developments, there are some things that we, can discard. But we need to start making those plans right now, very concrete plans. Obviously, rule number 1, no private central bank. Rule number 2, no private central bank. Rule number 3, no private central bank. And there's a lot of other common sense ideas that we can have. A lot of people are writing in suggestions. Somebody wrote in and said, make sure that if there is a legislative body, that any bill put through that body only deals with one issue. You don't have this for other purposes that is used to railroad through things that are bad for the people and good for the corporations. I think in an age of global internet communication, it is possible to have a direct participatory democracy where whatever government we have in this land after this one is through dying is a caretaker, that their job is to take care of the roads, schools, and hospitals, and the really big policy choices like trillions to bail out the banks or going to war are put to a direct popular vote. We need to have vote fraud or election fraud, the highest of the high crimes, resulting in immediate disqualification of the candidate. We have to make it a situation where honesty and truth in government is incentivized and bad behavior is penalized. Now, the Founding Fathers tried to create a government like that, but we know over time corrupting forces will go to work on the government, and the best that we can do is try and create a system of government that will delay the corrupting influences as long as possible. And just a nation where power is divided, which we no longer have, checks and balances. The original idea of the Founding Fathers was a really good one. Jefferson had a really good idea, and I think we need to go back to that. But when we have a government that is turning a blind eye to Wall Street fraud, that simply votes themselves new powers on a whim, and the American people are completely disenfranchised through massive vote fraud, we are pretty much at the end of the history of this particular government.
You know what? I agree, Michael, and I agree with everything you just said. It all sounds, great. I mean, that's what we need in this country. But from what you said, are you saying that we do have, or we have appointed a group of people that will get up there when the collapse happens? We do have the appointed legislation of people that want to do the right thing to get up there and start taking over the right way? Is that what you're telling me?
Well, we're going to have to find those people. Obviously, Ron Paul and Cynthia McKinney are two that I would nominate to be pulled together to form that new government. Again, we need to make sure that the government is kept absolutely hamstrung. We need to have laws that do make it illegal for corporate-owned media to lie to the public. We don't have that right now. We need to have a law that makes it illegal for a political candidate to lie to the public in his speeches. We don't have that right now. In fact, lying to the public is considered protected speech under the First Amendment in the current view of things. And I disagree with that. The First Amendment is not there to protect lies. It's there to protect the truth. And we need to certainly keep that First Amendment for free speech, freedom of political expression, no state religion. We need to make sure that we reinforce that one going forward. You know, and we all need to be working on our own version of the blueprint for the new America, because if we're not ready to set up that new government to serve the people, there are going to be no end of carpetbaggers who are going to come in here and say, I got your new government all set here, just sign your name on the dotted line and you'll have a brand new private central bank, and they'll just start the scam all over again, because that's been their history. But first and foremost, the most important thing is to prevent the rise of a private central bank that is given control of the money supply. And the Congress of 1913 and President Woodrow Wilson broke the law creating the Federal Reserve because they did it without the required constitutional amendment.
Exactly. You're right, Mike. But you know what? To get the right people to do what's supposed to be done the right way, and I'm sure you'll agree with me, is that it's not going to come without resistance, because the liberals, they want these type of people to continue controlling.
Well, we can't just put this on the liberals. The money junkies of both parties and of all religious faiths want things to go on the way they are right now. So hamstringing those money junkies is the top priority, and that's why I say no private central bank. Going to let you go here. Got a break for commercials. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're going to go back to the phones. Glenn in Philadelphia. Aloha, Glenn. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind today?
Hi, Mike. I believe it was you who mentioned a story last week that said something about the U.S. a number of weeks ago having sent some diplomatic personnel to North Korea, and that Japan had cried foul and was told to shut up or they'd upset the apple cart. Does that ring a bell with you?
Yeah, it does. It wasn't just diplomatic people. It was apparently several cargo planes full of some unspecified equipment as well.
Oh, interesting. Well, so obviously there was interchange between the two governments of some sort going on there.
Yes, there was.
And what's intriguing about that is I have a hypothesis about that. Two things due to happen this Wednesday. Kim Jong-un has warned the diplomatic personnel of various countries that for their own safety, they might want to be out of there by then. And this Wednesday also happens to be the day when Obama's budget is due to go before the Congress.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in creating this humongous distraction about North Korea, this could be a win-win for both Kim Jong-un and the Obama administration. Kim Jong-un gets to posture and vamp before his people about how he took on and backed down the great Satan, and he can maybe get a flow of money by getting his sanctions decreased a bit and all this. Obama can win by having attention distracted away from his budget proposals and the fact that he's sticking it to his own voter base with cuts in Medicare, Social Security, et cetera, ad nauseum. And then Obama also gets to say how much we need a strong military presence and to continue in a Cold War mentality because of all these threats, because we need a strong military. So it's all about control, appearance, and keeping money flowing to North Korea, money flowing to the military establishment, and taking money from the social program, all in the big mudstorm, muddy waters, by creating muddy waters.
It's a very good observation, and I think probably Obama is thinking along those terms. But something else driving the April 10th date is the fact that that is the day that it is expected North Korea will test fire their medium-range rockets, which the U.S. could then seize on as being a provocation leading to intervention in North Korea. Because over and above distracting away from Obama's budget, again, the real agenda is to somehow get into some kind of a conflict with China directly in order to politically and economically isolate them, because right now a far bigger threat to the U.S. government, bigger than public exposure of a very unpleasant budget, is China's gold-backed yuan. And look what happened to Libya when they came out with the gold dinar and a state bank and said Libya's oil is for sale only for the gold dinar. Next thing you know, they invade, they kill Gaddafi. Libya now has a private central bank issuing the public currency as a loan at interest, and the Libyan people are very unhappy with that. The reason they went in and killed Saddam Hussein was that starting in 2002, Saddam Hussein got permission from the United Nations to sell Iraq's oil for the euro. And so they invade, they lynch Saddam Hussein, Iraq's oil is back on the world market, but only for the U.S. dollar. It is that shackling of the world's resource-rich areas to the dollar that is the top agenda for all of these wars that we're seeing. And as we see these new countries coming up reporting on massive new gas and oil discoveries in East Africa, they're going to be put on the list of places to be invaded. They have Al-Qaeda, they have weapons of mass destruction, they hate us for our freedoms, and so forth and so on.
Right. You had also mentioned the failure of the Typhoon 2 missile previously. I remember at the time there was some speculation that the failure of that missile happened at an improbable time, when it should have been supposedly in a less risky phase or something like that. And there was speculation about that perhaps having been taken out by some sort of advanced technology or particle beam weapon or something like that.
Well, my understanding was that North Korea has a problem with multi-stage rockets as a general issue. That when their rockets are staging, they tend to become unstable and explode. Just looking at the rockets, I note how incredibly thin and narrow they all are, which, of course, if you want them to have less wind resistance, you would go for that. But that means that any torque put on that rocket by the maneuvering rocket engines is going to create much higher stress at those joining points. And I hope nobody from North Korea is listening right now. If their rocket engines are swiveling and maneuvering at the moment they stage, I think that's probably going to be a big reason why they're having problems with that. But that was my understanding, is they explode on staging.
Well, that's intriguing, but in this situation, I don't think North Korea's military people are the only ones overcompensating for an inability to get it up.
Oh, groan. All right, thanks an awful lot, Glenn. We're going to let you go with it. And you know something, look back at the United States' initial space program and rocketry, and the reason Russia beat us into space with Sputnik was because originally the military in the United States were given the pole position getting into space, and they had the Vanguard program. They were using, I think it was the Juno C ICBM as their launching platform, and it kept blowing up all the time. And finally, Eisenhower gave the green light to the NACA to do a try with their Redstone and Explorer 1, and they got Explorer 1 up there just shortly after Sputnik and did some real science with it, the Van Allen radiation belts. There were a lot of exploding missiles in the early days here in the United States. It's a learning exercise. But as far as what's going on with North Korea's staging problems, it looks to me like the way they've designed their rockets for exceptional thinness has probably increased the possibility of stress to the point of failure on those seams during staging, where it's going to separate less than cleanly and tear it apart. That's my opinion. I'd like to see more information on the blueprints on those rockets before I hang my hat on that, but I think that's what's going on, because the failure of the Typhoon 2 does seem to be associated with staging the vehicle. And it's not unique to North Korea. South Korea was having problems with their rockets staging incorrectly. I think, if I recall correctly, back during the Clinton administration, there was a huge scandal where I think it was the Loral Corporation was transferring staging technology to one of the two Koreas. So these things get handed around here. Now, over in Lebanon, the new Lebanese prime minister is trying to establish a policy of strict neutrality regarding Syria. Doesn't want to be on Syria's side, doesn't want to be on the U.S. and Israeli side, just says, leave us alone. And I don't think he understands that when this war in Syria really gets overt, that Israel is likely to invade Lebanon again, and that will be the end of Lebanon's neutrality, because Israel still wants that Litani River. They want that fresh water source. They want it to come to Israel and not to the Lebanese people. Meanwhile, apparently the Lebanese army has intercepted and foiled an attempt to deliver arms to internal extremist groups. Somebody, who shall remain nameless, was apparently trying to send heavy weapons into these extremist groups in the Chouf district of southwestern Lebanon, and it resulted in a firefight over the Lebanese army and the people trying to smuggle those weapons in. So it looks like somebody's already planning some kind of a covert overthrow of the Lebanese government. Gee, I wonder who that might be. Now, as I mentioned to that previous caller, nations in East Africa are all of a sudden discovering they are sitting on a lot of oil and gas. Along Africa's Indian Ocean coast, there's been a lot of oil fields. Now they're looking at more and more of these, East Africa's coastal region. And they're saying the stretching out to the Seychelles holds an estimated 441 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. That's about 50% more than is in Saudi Arabia. So those poor countries are going to be put on the list of nations to be invaded to make sure that that oil and gas is only sold for the U.S. dollars. And hard on the heel of the news about that oil and gas discovery, StratRisks.com is reporting that now the United States says Uganda is degenerating into violence and we may have to intervene for humanitarian reasons. Blah, 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 blah. Back to the phones. Tom in Texas. Aloha, Tom. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Aloha, Brother Mike. I'm really impressed with your show.
Thank you.
And 99.9% of your callers, I'm impressed with them, too.
We have a very intelligent audience, very aware.
Yes, you do have. And I can see why you attract them. But earlier in the show, you had mentioned about how Israel refuses to give equal respect to Palestine as far as being recognized.
Yes.
Is there another P5+1 meeting as far as Iranian nuclear?
There's supposed to be a continuation of the negotiations, but the previous P5+1 failed to accomplish anything, and again, the United States is in there with their attitude of Iran must shut all their nuclear facilities down first, and then we'll talk about lifting sanctions. Meanwhile, Iran and pretty much everybody else is saying, why don't you lift some of the sanctions now as a show of good faith? And again, the U.S. is taking that hardline approach, which is a negotiating position designed to fail.
I see. Well, the reason I'm not a world leader is because of my attitude about such things. If I were Iran, I would tell the nuclear inspection team that we'll submit to the exact same inspections that Israel does. Let's make it equal, okay?
I'd go for that, but of course Israel will not. Israel has never signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Israel does not allow IAEA inspections of all of its facilities, and yet Israel was caught trying to sell a clandestine nuclear weapon to South Africa, which is the very activity the Non-Proliferation Treaty is supposed to prevent.
Well, Mike, I just had to throw that out there at you. I know it's getting close to the end of the show. Keep up the good work, brother.
All right, thanks an awful lot, and thank you for the phone call.
Thanks for the time.
You got it. Now, over in France, their government is just getting hit with scandal after scandal after scandal. Their foreign minister has been accused of hiding his money in secret Swiss bank accounts. And on top of all of these other scandals, Budget Minister Jerome Chahuzak had to resign over his secret Swiss bank account. And it's beginning to undermine the French public's confidence in Holland's entire government. And they're already starting to see calls for Parliament to be dissolved and new elections, because the government they have absolutely cannot be trusted. It's corrupt from bottom to top. Well, welcome to our world. Now, there's an interesting story that came out of Montana, where apparently the GOP-dominated state legislature is voting themselves through all kinds of bizarre laws to tighten voter registration and apparently to restrict the right of third parties to enter the general elections. Now, somebody out there, I've read the Constitution, but my brain's a little fuzzy. Where does it say in the Constitution that any one political party has the right or authority to deny any other political party from entering the elections? I don't think that's in the Constitution. And yet the GOP is doing that up in Montana. Now, Obama is back on his gun grab. He's out there saying, oh, we must save the children, blah, 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 blah. Apparently, he's going to use Air Force One to fly a bunch of the Newtown parents to Washington, D.C., so they can cry and shed tears in front of the United States Congress and say, please ban those bad old guns. We've got to. And I just wanted to remind everybody of this well-documented link between school shootings and SSRI antidepressants. It's a very long, very well-documented linkage. These medications are not always helpful. They can trigger extreme acts of violence. It came out last week that James Holmes, the Aurora shooter, was on these medications. He was on a generic version of Zoloft. He had told his psychiatrist that he was having uncontrollable homicidal thoughts. And the psychiatrist warned the police, and the police did nothing because they needed a theater full of bloody shirts to wave around. Remember, before the gun grab agenda got going, Fox News reported on the link between SSRIs and mass violence. Michael Moore was on video saying that, yes, there was a problem between SSRIs and gun violence. They know it's a problem, but now the agenda is to grab the guns. We're going to blame the guns for mass shootings just like we blame cars for drunk driving. More people are killed by drunk drivers than by assault rifles in this country. You don't see Obama out there saying it's time to ban cars or limit cars to only 35 miles per hour, sort of the magazine limit situation. They don't blame the cars for drunk driving. They understand it is a chemical substance that causes responsible people to behave in an irresponsible manner, and the exact same thing is true here. Now, you already know this. You know that on my website, whatreallyhappened.com, in the right margin is that giant pill that is a permanent link to a resource page with all of these horror stories from SSRIstories.com, the video of Michael Moore, the video of Fox News, several other videos that document this problem. And I need you to grab that page, this resource page for violence and SSRIs, and you need to start mailing it to all your friends, mail it to everybody that you know in the corporate media, or even if you're a total stranger. We need to force this into the public eye, because Obama is out there with a full court press to come up with seizing your guns. And once he gets your guns, he's coming after your gold, your silver, any tangible assets you have to prop up the Ponzi scheme bank. And after that, he's coming for your sons and daughters to throw into more of these wars of conquest to bring the world safely back to Bretton Woods. Going to go back to the phones. Danny in South Carolina. Aloha, Danny. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Aloha, Michael. I just want to know if you'd covered the Leviathan oil field in the eastern Mediterranean yet on any of your programs.
You're talking about the one where Israel is trying to claim it's all theirs, even though it extends into Gaza and Lebanon territorial waters?
Yes. If you look at the people who discovered it, the Nobel Energy Corporation in Houston, Texas, if you look at their map, they got 6 little red dots there. Right off the coast of the Gaza Strip.
Yes.
And that is I don't know, it's in litigation in various stages, I think, with Cyprus. But no one's talking about this Israeli reticence to give up the Gaza Strip maybe have something to do with the fact that they've got wells, exploratory, and even a couple of producing wells, and what promises to be a very large oil and gas.
Well, Israel never gives up anything, and back when Ariel Sharon made that deal where we'll leave Gaza and in exchange for you turning a blind eye to the settlements, I said they'll take it back first chance they get. Got to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. Last segment of the show today, and I want to recap a couple of things we said earlier in the program, most notably how the European Central Bank is demanding the government of Portugal rein in their constitutional court who dared to say that the austerity measures imposed on Portugal contradicted with the Portuguese constitution. And I think it's a red warning flag that should wake everybody up to the fact that, in point of fact, these private central bankers are the new government. Self-created, self-appointed. They're not elected. They don't represent the people. They don't even represent the best interests of the nation. They exist to serve themselves. And now they are acting like they are in charge of the government. And this is the realization of Rothschild's dream. Give me control of a nation's money, and I care not who makes the laws. And that's exactly where we are. We see that here in the United States of America with the Federal Reserve, which is a private central bank. It's no more federal than Federal Express. And you have the former chairman of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, on video admitting the Federal Reserve answers to no federal government authority. They are above the law. They are the law. They control the money. You can't audit them. They will set the tone. They will just hand out all this money to their friends on Wall Street and stick future generations with the bill. And it is a Ponzi scheme. Every one of these private central banks issuing the public currency as a loan at interest is a Ponzi scheme intended to enslave populations with the illusion of debt. It's rule by compound interest. And it's no more legitimate a form of global governments or governments at all than rule by divine right or rule by slavery. What we are seeing in all of these nations with these private central banks is staggering amounts of artificially created debt, money that is owed to the bankers that never existed in the first place. It's just a bookkeeping entry. And all of these banks, which now presume to be the governments of the nations that are enslaved to them, serve only one purpose: the acquisition of wealth for the bank's owners. And we need to ask ourselves, is it possible for human civilization to survive when the acquisition of personal wealth by a tiny minority is the only priority for the entirety of our society? When all other considerations, the general health of the population, the quality of the infrastructure, the ability to manufacture good products or to grow healthy food, when those are all subordinate to the acquisition of more material wealth, human civilization as a whole is at risk. Because human civilization encompasses more than just the desire for wealth. It's certainly the desire to leave a decent world for our children to grow up in. There has to be balance. I'm not opposed to making money, but it has to be balanced by other priorities. And those other priorities right now are virtually non-existent, and that is a danger. Going to head on out here for today. We'll be back tomorrow on the Republic Broadcasting Network. Until then, stay safe, stay informed, make good choices. Please spread the word about Republic Broadcasting and what really happened with all your friends in social media. We need to get the word out and get more people plugged into what's really going on. Please support Republic Broadcasting. Please support whatreallyhappened.com, and aloha, America.